The last words Sarah ever spoke to me still echo in my head sometimes, usually in those quiet moments right before sleep when your mind decides to replay every painful memory you've tried to bury. You'll die alone, Marcus. You're pathetic and you'll always be pathetic. No one will ever love you the way I did, and even that wasn't enough. She said it with such casual cruelty, like she was commenting on the weather, not obliterating what I thought was the love of my life. That was 3 years ago. Today, I'm sitting in my kitchen, watching my wife Emma make pancakes while our 2-year-old daughter tries to help by dumping flour everywhere, and I can't help but smile at the delicious irony of it all. But getting here, to this moment of pure happiness that Sarah swore would never exist for me, that's a story worth telling. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or elaborate schemes. Sometimes it's simply proving someone catastrophically wrong about who you are. I should probably start at the beginning, though the beginning feels like a lifetime ago now. Sarah and I met in college. One of those whirlwind romances that feels destined when you're 22 and stupid. She was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful in that effortless way that made other guys hate me, smart enough to challenge me, funny enough to make me forget my insecurities. We moved in together after graduation, got a small apartment downtown, adopted a cat we named Professor Whiskers because we thought we were hilarious. For 2 years, I thought I was living the dream. I worked my ass off at a marketing firm. She taught elementary school, and we talked about the future like it was this bright, shining thing waiting for us. Marriage, kids, maybe a house with a white picket fence. All the cliches that feel profound when you're in love. I was saving up for a ring, had actually picked one out, and was planning to propose on our 3-year anniversary. The funny thing about betrayal is how it creeps up on you. There's no dramatic music, no obvious signs, just small changes that your brain explains away because you trust the person you love. Sarah started working late more often. She became protective of her phone in a way she'd never been before. When I'd try to plan things for us, she'd seem distracted, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. I told myself it was stress. New curriculum at school, difficult parents, budget cuts, teachers deal with a lot of bullshit. I even felt proud of myself for being understanding, for giving her space when she needed it. What a fucking idiot I was. The truth revealed itself on a Tuesday evening in October. I'd gotten off work early and decided to surprise Sarah with dinner from her favorite Thai place. I remember feeling so pleased with myself, imagining her face when she walked into our apartment to find candles lit and pad thai waiting. I even stopped to buy flowers, white roses, because she always said they were more elegant than red ones. I heard her before I saw her, her laugh bright and genuine in a way I hadn't heard in months, floating down the hallway as I climbed the stairs to our 3rd-floor apartment. For just a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe whatever had been bothering her was finally resolving itself. Maybe we were going to get back to the good place we'd been in. Then I heard the other voice, male, intimate, saying her name in a way that made my stomach drop like I was falling off a cliff. My hands shook as I fumbled with my keys. The logical part of my brain was still making excuses. Maybe it was her brother. Maybe it was a friend going through a hard time. Maybe I was misinterpreting what I was hearing, but my body knew better. My body was already flooding with adrenaline, preparing for the impact of whatever I was about to discover. I opened the door as quietly as I could. The Thai food and flowers still clutched in my hands like props in a play I no longer understood. The living room was empty, but I could hear them clearly now. Hushed voices from our bedroom, followed by sounds that left no room for misinterpretation. I stood there in our entryway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, listening to my girlfriend of 3 years fucking someone else in the bed we shared. The bed where she'd told me she loved me just that morning before leaving for work. The bed where we'd planned our future and whispered our dreams and made love countless times. The roses slipped from my numb fingers, scattering across the hardwood floor like evidence of my stupidity. The Thai food followed, containers bursting open and spreading pad thai across our welcome mat, like some kind of sick metaphor for everything falling apart. That's when the bedroom door opened. Sarah emerged first, wearing my favorite of her sundresses, the yellow one with tiny flowers that she'd worn on our second date. Her hair was messed up in that specific way that happens after sex, and she was laughing at something the man behind her had said. She looked happy, genuinely, radiantly happy in a way I realized she hadn't looked with me in months. The man was tall, older than us, wearing an expensive-looking button-down shirt that screamed money in a way my discount polo never could. I didn't recognize him, which somehow made it worse. This wasn't even someone from her past coming back to complicate things. This was someone new, someone she'd chosen over me, someone she'd been building a relationship with while pretending to build one with me. They saw me at the same time. The man, let's call him Brad, because he looked like every Brad who'd ever made me feel inadequate, went pale and took a step backward. Sarah just stopped, her smile freezing on her face like she was a video that had suddenly buffered. "Marcus," she said, and I could hear her mind racing, trying to figure out what story to tell. What lie might possibly explain this away? "You're home early." That was her opening line. Not "I'm sorry," not "this isn't what it looks like," not even a denial, just an observation about my schedule, delivered in the same tone she might use to comment on the weather. I looked at Brad, who was now actively backing toward our bedroom, like he could somehow retreat into non-existence. I looked at the scattered roses and the ruined dinner. I looked at Sarah, who was starting to get that defensive expression she wore when she'd been caught doing something wrong. Like the time I'd found out she'd been lying about visiting her sister when she was actually going to bars with her college friends. "How long?" I asked. My voice sounded strange, like it was coming from very far away. Sarah's chin lifted in that stubborn way that had once seemed cute. "Marcus, let's talk about this." "How long, Sarah?" Brad chose that moment to clear his throat. "Maybe I should go," he said, like he was the innocent party here. Like he just stumbled into this situation instead of actively participating in the destruction of my relationship. "Yeah," I said, not taking my eyes off Sarah. "Maybe you should." I listened to him gather his things, heard our bedroom door close as he presumably got dressed, heard him mumble something to Sarah as he slipped past me toward the front door. He paused like he might say something to me, an apology maybe, or some kind of explanation, but I guess he thought better of it. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and then Sarah and I were alone with the wreckage of everything I thought I knew about my life. 6 months, she said finally, like she was confessing to a minor crime instead of obliterating our entire relationship. It started 6 months ago. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of coming home to her and telling her about my day, while she smiled and nodded and pretended to care, all while she was building something real with someone else. 6 months of me being a joke, a placeholder, a convenience while she figured out her actual future? Why? The word came out broken, barely audible. Sarah sat down on our couch, the one we'd picked out together at IKEA, arguing playfully about whether to get the blue cushions or the gray ones. And suddenly she looked tired. Not guilty, not heartbroken, just tired. Like this conversation was an inconvenience she'd been dreading. "You want the truth?" she asked. I nodded, though I was beginning to suspect I really didn't. "You're safe, Marcus. You're sweet and reliable and you love me, and that should be enough, but it's not. You don't challenge me. You don't excite me. You're like a warm blanket. Comfortable, but not exactly thrilling." Each word hit me like a physical blow. I sank into the chair across from her, the one I'd always thought of as my chair where I'd sit every evening after work while she told me about her day. "I tried to make it work," she continued, and now there was a note of defensiveness in her voice, like I was the one who owed her an apology. "I really did. But Derek makes me feel alive in a way you never have. He's successful, he's ambitious, he knows what he wants. When I'm with him, I feel like the best version of myself. Derek, so not Brad." I filed that information away for reasons I couldn't yet articulate. "And with me?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but not in a way that made me feel better. It was pity, I realized. She was looking at me with pity. "With you, I feel like I'm settling, like I'm playing it safe instead of really living. You're a good guy, Marcus, but good isn't enough anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear our upstairs neighbor's TV, could hear traffic from the street below, could hear the normal sounds of a world that was continuing to exist even though mine had just ended. "So what now?" I asked finally. "I think you should move out," she said. "The lease is in my name anyway. Derek and we're getting serious. He's talking about moving in together." The casual way she said it, like she was discussing weekend plans instead of erasing our entire shared life, broke something inside me that I didn't even know was breakable. Just like that? "Marcus, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We both know this hasn't been working for a while." That was the moment I snapped. Not violently, not dramatically, but something inside me just broke, clean through. Both of us. My voice was getting louder now, all the shock wearing off and being replaced by something much more dangerous. I thought things were fine, Sarah. I thought we were building something together. I was going to propose to you. Her eyes widened slightly at that, but she recovered quickly. See? That's exactly what I'm talking about. You were planning our entire future without even asking if I wanted the same things. You just assumed that because you were happy, I was too. Because you told me you were. Because when I talked about marriage and kids and buying a house, you smiled and agreed and made plans with me. I was trying to want those things, she said, and for the first time, she looked genuinely sad. I wanted to be the kind of person who could be happy with that life. But I'm not. I stared at her. This woman I'd loved for 3 years. This woman I'd rearranged my entire life around. And realized I didn't know her at all. The Sarah I'd fallen in love with was apparently a fiction. A role she'd been playing while she figured out what she actually wanted. So the past 3 years meant nothing to you? They weren't nothing, she said quietly. You helped me figure out who I am. And part of who I am is someone who needs more than what you can give me. That's when she said it. The words that would haunt me for months, that would echo in my head during my darkest moments, that would fuel the anger that eventually transformed into something much more productive. I'm sorry, Marcus, but you'll die alone if you don't change. You're pathetic, and you'll always be pathetic. No one will ever love you the way I did, and even that wasn't enough. You're just not enough. You'll never be enough for anyone who matters. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was delivering a medical diagnosis instead of demolishing whatever was left of my self-worth. Like she was doing me a favor by being honest about my fundamental inadequacy as a human being. I left that night, packed a suitcase with whatever I could grab quickly, and went to stay with my friend Jake, who took one look at my face and handed me a beer without asking any questions. I spent the next week in a haze of humiliation and rage, replaying every moment of our relationship and seeing all the signs I'd missed. All the ways Sarah had been pulling away while I'd been planning our future. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how completely I'd misjudged everything. How confident I'd been in our relationship. How certain I'd been that we were happy. How utterly blind I'd been to her growing contempt for me. It made me question everything about myself. Every instinct I'd ever had. Every relationship I'd ever thought I understood. But after that first week of wallowing, something shifted. I was lying on Jake's couch at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling and replaying Sarah's final words for the 1,000th time, when I realized something important. She was wrong. Not just wrong about me, but wrong about everything. Sarah had painted me as this pathetic, unambitious loser who would never amount to anything. But that wasn't true. I had a good job that I was actually pretty successful at. I had friends who genuinely cared about me. I had interests and passions that had nothing to do with her. I'd just been so focused on building our life together that I'd stopped nurturing all the other parts of myself. But more than that, I realized that Sarah's definition of enough was fundamentally flawed. She wanted excitement and challenge and someone who made her feel like she was living some kind of movie. But those things aren't actually what make relationships work long-term. Stability, kindness, genuine care for another person, those were the things that built real love, not whatever chemical rush she was chasing with Derek. That's when I decided to prove her wrong, not out of spite, or not entirely out of spite, but because I genuinely believed she was wrong about who I was and what I was capable of. I started small. I found my own apartment, a 1-bedroom place in a neighborhood I'd always wanted to live in, but Sarah had thought was too expensive. I bought furniture that I actually liked instead of compromising on everything. I signed up for the gym membership I'd been talking about for years. I started cooking for myself, really cooking, not just heating up frozen dinners. But the real work was internal. I started therapy, which Sarah had always dismissed as self-indulgent. Whenever I'd mentioned it, Dr. Martinez helped me understand that I'd been so focused on being the perfect boyfriend that I'd lost sight of being an interesting person. I'd molded myself around Sarah's preferences and opinions until I wasn't sure what my own were anymore. Slowly, carefully, I started to remember who I was outside of that relationship. I reconnected with old friends Sarah had found boring. I picked up hobbies I'd abandoned because they didn't interest her. I started saying yes to invitations and opportunities I would have declined before, just to see what would happen. And something amazing did happen. I started to like myself again. It took about 6 months for me to feel like a complete person instead of half of a broken couple. 6 months of therapy and self-reflection and deliberately pushing myself out of my comfort zone. 6 months of learning to be alone without feeling lonely, of discovering that my own company was actually pretty good. That's when I met Emma. I almost didn't go to the work party where we met. It was a Friday night and I was tired, and my old instinct was to go home and order pizza and watch Netflix. But I'd made a promise to myself to say yes to more things, so I showed up. Emma was there with a friend who worked in our accounting department. She was funny and smart and beautiful. But more than that, she seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Not politely interested the way you are with strangers at parties, but actually engaged, asking follow-up questions and building on my stories with her own. We talked for 3 hours about books we'd read, places we'd traveled, things we wanted to do. She told me about her job as a nurse, about the kids she worked with in the pediatric ward, about how she'd gotten into nursing because she wanted to do something that mattered. I told her about my work, but also about the photography hobby I'd recently picked up, about the hiking trails I'd been exploring, about the cooking classes I was taking. When the party started winding down, I almost let her leave without asking for her number. The old me, the me that Sarah had convinced was fundamentally inadequate, whispered that someone like Emma would never be interested in someone like me. But the new me, the me that had spent 6 months learning to value myself, told that voice to shut up. "Would you like to have dinner sometime?" I asked as she was putting on her coat. She smiled. Not the polite smile you give someone when you're about to let them down easy, but a real smile that reached her eyes. I'd love that. Our first date was perfect in all the ways my relationship with Sarah had never been. We went to a small Italian restaurant I discovered in my new neighborhood, and we talked easily for hours. Emma laughed at my jokes, but she also challenged my opinions when she disagreed with them. She was interested in my photography, but she also had her own passions that had nothing to do with me. Most importantly, she made me feel like myself. Not a better version of myself or a compromised version of myself. Just myself. The person I actually was, quirks and flaws included, was enough for her. We took things slowly. After the disaster with Sarah, I was gun-shy about rushing into anything, and Emma had her own reasons for wanting to be careful. She'd gotten out of a long-term relationship about a year before we met, and she was enjoying her independence too much to give it up for anything less than extraordinary. But what we had was extraordinary in quiet, sustainable ways that I was finally wise enough to recognize and value. Emma didn't make me feel like I was living in a movie. She made me feel like I was living in real life, but a really good version of real life. We dated for 8 months before I told her I loved her. Another 4 months before we moved in together. A year after that, I proposed. Not because I was afraid of losing her, not because I thought it was what I was supposed to do, but because I couldn't imagine building a future with anyone else. Emma said yes immediately, and then she cried happy tears while I slipped the ring onto her finger. The ring I'd picked out specifically for her, after months of paying attention to what she liked, what spoke to her. Not the ring I'd chosen for Sarah based on what I thought an engagement ring should look like. We got married 18 months later in a small ceremony with close friends and family. Nothing fancy, nothing designed for Instagram. Just two people who loved each other, making a public commitment to build a life together. Emma looked absolutely radiant in her simple white dress, and I couldn't stop smiling as we exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. Sarah wasn't invited, obviously. I hadn't spoken to her since that awful night in our old apartment, and I had no desire to. But I thought about her as Emma and I danced to our first song as a married couple. I thought about how wrong she'd been about everything, how completely she'd misjudged not just me, but what actually matters in life. Emma got pregnant 6 months after our wedding. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't unwelcome either. We talked about kids, knew we both wanted them, figured we'd wait a year or two, but weren't devastated when biology had other plans. Pregnancy suited Emma. She glowed in that way people always talk about, but I'd never really understood before. Watching her grow our baby, seeing her excitement and preparation and fierce protectiveness, made me fall in love with her all over again. Lily was born on a Tuesday morning in May, after 12 hours of labor that Emma handled with more grace and strength than I would have thought humanly possible. When the doctor placed our daughter in my arms for the first time, I cried harder than I ever had in my life. This tiny, perfect person was half me and half the woman I loved more than anything in the world. She was proof that Sarah had been catastrophically wrong about my future, about my capacity for love and happiness and building something meaningful. But more than that, holding Lily made me grateful for everything that had happened before. If Sarah hadn't broken my heart, I never would have done the work to become the person Emma fell in love with. If I hadn't gone through that period of forced self-examination, I never would have been ready for the kind of relationship Emma and I have. That's the thing about rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to build on. Now Lily is 2 years old and she's everything I never knew I wanted. She has Emma's eyes and my stubborn streak and a laugh that could cure depression. She's curious about everything, fearless in the way only toddlers can be, and absolutely convinced that I'm the most important person in the universe. Emma and I are talking about having another baby. We're in no hurry, but we both love being parents, love watching Lily discover the world, love the family we've built together. Our house, or the house we bought last year, with the big backyard and the good school district, feels full of life and laughter and possibility. And sometimes in quiet moments like this morning, when I'm watching Emma make pancakes and Lily is helping, and Professor Whiskers II is weaving between our legs hoping for drop bacon, I think about Sarah's prediction that I would die alone. I wonder if she knows how wrong she was. I wonder if she's happy with Derek, if whatever excitement and challenge she was chasing turned out to be sustainable. I hope she is, honestly, not because I'm a saint, but because I genuinely don't care anymore. Her opinion of me and my future was just that. Her opinion, based on her limited understanding of what makes life meaningful. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a part of me that wants her to know. That wants her to see the life I've built, the love I've found, the family I've created. Not to hurt her, but to prove a point about the power of actually knowing someone before you write them off forever. That's why, when Jake told me he'd run into Sarah at a coffee shop downtown and that she'd asked about me, I didn't immediately change the subject the way I had every other time someone had mentioned her over the past few years. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "Just that you were doing well. Married, new baby, bought a house. The basics." I could see him watching my reaction, probably worried that hearing about Sarah would send me into some kind of emotional spiral. But I felt nothing. Not anger, not hurt, not even curiosity about her life now. Just a kind of distant satisfaction that the life I'd built would serve as a quiet refutation of everything she'd believed about me. "How did she seem when you told her?" Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. "Surprised, I think. Maybe a little. I don't know. Wistful? Like she was remembering something she'd forgotten." I nodded and changed the subject, but the conversation stuck with me. Not because I wanted to reconnect with Sarah, or even because I particularly cared about her reaction to news of my happiness, but because it occurred to me that my life now was the most elegant possible response to her cruelty. She'd told me I would die alone, that I was pathetic, that I would never be enough for anyone who mattered. But here I am, surrounded by people who love me exactly as I am. I have a wife who chose me not because I was safe or convenient, but because I make her life better. I have a daughter who thinks I hung the moon. I have friends who genuinely enjoy my company and a career that I'm actually proud of. More than that, I've learned that being enough isn't about being the most exciting person in the room or the most ambitious or the most anything. It's about being genuine, being present, being willing to grow and change and love deeply. It's about building something real instead of chasing something that looks good from the outside. Sarah was chasing a feeling, that rush of new love, the excitement of someone who seemed larger than life. But feelings fade. The butterflies settle down, the mystery gets solved. The person who seemed so exciting becomes familiar and then ordinary and then maybe even boring. What Emma and I have is different. It's built on seeing each other clearly and choosing each other anyway. It's built on shared values and genuine compatibility and the kind of deep affection that only comes from really knowing someone. It's not always thrilling, but it's always solid. It's not a roller coaster, but it's not supposed to be. That's what Sarah never understood. That sustainable love isn't about finding someone who makes you feel like you're living in a movie. It's about finding someone who makes ordinary life feel extraordinary, who makes Tuesday morning pancakes feel like a gift, who makes you want to be the best version of yourself, not because you're trying to impress them, but because they inspire you to grow. I used to think revenge was about making someone pay for hurting you. But the older I get, the more I think real revenge is about proving them wrong. Not through some elaborate scheme or dramatic confrontation, but through the simple act of living well, of building something beautiful out of the ashes they left behind. Sarah's final words to me were meant to be a life sentence, a prediction of permanent loneliness and inadequacy that would follow me forever. Instead, they became a challenge that I rose to meet. Every happy moment in my life now is a small rebellion against her certainty that I would never find real love. And the beautiful thing is that she'll probably never know the full extent of how wrong she was. She'll never see Lily take her first steps, or hear Emma laugh at one of my terrible dad jokes, or witness the 1,000 small moments of joy that make up our daily life. She'll exist forever on the outside of the happiness she was so sure I'd never find. That's not cruel. It's just the natural consequence of writing someone off completely. When you decide someone isn't worth your time or attention, you forfeit the right to be part of their story when it gets good. But I'll know. Every morning when I wake up next to Emma, every time Lily runs to me when I get home from work, every family dinner and bedtime story, and lazy Sunday morning, I'll know that Sarah's prophecy was wrong. Not just wrong, but spectacularly, completely, beautifully wrong. I'll know that I didn't die alone. I lived surrounded by love, built a family that chose me back, created something lasting and meaningful and real. I'll know that I was enough after all, just not for her. And honestly, that's perfectly fine with me. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't a dish served cold. It's a life served warm, full of the kind of love that someone who hurt you was convinced you'd never find. It's proving that their limited vision of your potential says nothing about what you're actually capable of achieving. It's sitting in your kitchen on a Saturday morning, watching your wife make pancakes while your daughter giggles and makes a mess, and realizing that this ordinary moment is everything you never knew you wanted. And if that's not poetry, I don't know what is. The encounter I'd been unconsciously preparing for happened on a Thursday afternoon in September, almost exactly 3 years after our wedding. I was at the grocery store with Lily, who was going through a phase where she insisted on helping with everything, which meant our usual 20-minute shopping trip had stretched into an hour-long adventure of negotiating what constitutes a reasonable amount of goldfish crackers for one household. "Daddy, can we get the cookies with the princess on them?" Lily asked, pointing at a package of overpriced Disney-themed snacks with the kind of desperate longing that only a 2-year-old can muster. "We already have cookies at home, sweetheart," I said, trying to steer our cart around an elderly woman who was meticulously comparing pasta sauce labels. "But these ones have Princess Anna." I was about to launch into my well-practiced explanation about how cookies are sometimes food and not always food, when I heard a voice behind me that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Marcus?" I turned around slowly, still pushing the cart with one hand, while Lily continued her passionate advocacy for princess cookies, and found myself face to face with Sarah for the first time in over 4 years. She looked different. Older, obviously, but more than that, there was something brittle about her that I didn't remember. She was still beautiful, still put together in that carefully curated way that had once intimidated me. But there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and her smile seemed forced. "Sarah," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Hi." Her eyes immediately went to Lily, who had temporarily abandoned her cookie campaign and was now staring at this stranger with the frank curiosity of a toddler. "Is this?" Sarah started, then stopped, like she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "This is my daughter, Lily," I said, and I couldn't keep the pride out of my voice. "Lily, can you say hi to Sarah?" Lily, who had never met a stranger she didn't like, gave Sarah a cheerful wave. "Hi. We're buying groceries, but Daddy won't let me get princess cookies, even though they're very important." Despite everything, Sarah smiled. A real smile this time, not the frozen one she'd greeted me with. "Princess cookies do sound very important," she agreed. I felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised me with its intensity. This was my daughter, my perfect, innocent daughter, and Sarah was the woman who had tried to convince me I would never be worthy of love. The fact that she was being kind to Lily didn't erase the cruelty she'd shown me, but it also reminded me that people are complex, that the Sarah who had destroyed me and the Sarah who was smiling at my daughter could be the same person. "She's beautiful," Sarah said, looking back at me. "She has your eyes." "Thank you." I adjusted my grip on the cart handle, suddenly aware that this conversation was happening in the middle of a grocery store, surrounded by the mundane reality of other people buying milk and bread and toilet paper. It felt surreal, like a dream sequence where important moments happen in impossible places. "How old is she?" 2.5. I couldn't help the way my voice softened when I talked about Lily. "She's going through a very independent phase right now. Everything has to be done by herself, even when she clearly needs help." "That's the age," Sarah said, and there was something wistful in her voice that I couldn't quite interpret. I remember my sister going through that with her kids. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, Two people who had once shared everything now struggling to make small talk in the cereal aisle. Lily had gotten distracted by a display of cartoon-themed yogurt and was conducting what appeared to be a serious conversation with a picture of SpongeBob. "You look good," Sarah said finally. "Happy. I am happy." The words came out more firmly than I'd intended, but I didn't try to soften them. "Very happy. I'm glad." She paused, seemed to be working up to something. "Jake mentioned that you got married 2 years ago." I found myself reaching for my wedding ring, twisting it around my finger the way I did when I was nervous. "My wife Emma is amazing. She's a pediatric nurse." "That's wonderful." Sarah's voice was carefully neutral, but I caught something in her expression. A flicker of something that might have been regret, or loss, or just surprise. "I always thought you'd make a great husband and father." The irony of that statement hit me like a physical blow. "Funny," I said, and I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. "That's not what you said the last time we talked." Sarah's face went pale. For a moment, she looked exactly like she had that night in our apartment when she'd been caught with Derek, vulnerable and guilty, and searching for words that might somehow fix what she'd broken. "Marcus," she said quietly, Daddy, can we go find Mommy's crackers now?" Lily interrupted, tugging on my jeans. "I promised her we would get the ones with the seeds." "Of course, sweetheart." I looked back at Sarah, who was staring at Lily with an expression I couldn't read. "We should go. Emma's waiting for us at home." "Of course." Sarah stepped aside to let us pass, but then she said my name again, softer this time. "Marcus, wait." I stopped, though every instinct I had was telling me to keep walking, to not give her the chance to say whatever she was building up to. But maybe I needed to hear it. Maybe this was the closure I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. "I owe you an apology," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "What I said to you that night, it was cruel. It was inexcusably cruel, and I've regretted it every day since." Lily was getting restless, squirming in the cart seat and starting to make the noises that usually preceded a full meltdown. I needed to get moving, but I also needed to hear what Sarah had to say. "Why?" I asked. "Why did you say those things?" Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, like she was gathering strength. "Because I was scared," she said finally. "Because I knew I was throwing away something good for something that felt exciting, and I needed to convince myself that what we had wasn't really that good. I needed you to be the problem so I could feel better about what I was doing." "And Derek?" I asked, though I wasn't sure why it mattered anymore. Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Derek lasted 8 months. Turned out that when the excitement wore off and I got to know him as a person instead of an escape fantasy, he was actually kind of terrible. Selfish, controlling, obsessed with image over substance. Everything I convinced myself I wanted turned out to be everything I actually couldn't stand. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt that surge of satisfaction that comes with being proven right. But instead, I just felt sad for her. Sad that she'd blown up something real for something fake. Sad that she'd learned her lesson too late. Sad that we'd both had to go through so much pain to get to where we were now. "I'm sorry that didn't work out," I said, and I meant it. "Are you?" Sarah's smile was rueful. "Because if it had worked out, you might never have met Emma. You might never have had Lily." She was right, and we both knew it. If Sarah hadn't broken my heart, I never would have done the work to become the man Emma fell in love with. If I'd married Sarah, I'd be living a completely different life. Maybe not a bad life, but not this life. Not the life where I wake up every morning grateful for what I have, instead of wondering if it's enough. "That's true," I admitted. "But it still wasn't okay, what you said." "No," Sarah agreed. "It wasn't, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Marcus. You deserved better from me, and I hope you found it." Lily chose that moment to drop her stuffed elephant, which she'd been clutching throughout this entire conversation. It fell to the floor with a soft thud, and she immediately started crying with the kind of devastating sorrow that only toddlers can achieve over minor mishaps. "Oh no, Ellie!" I bent down to retrieve the elephant, then handed it back to Lily, who clutched it to her chest like she'd been reunited with a long-lost friend. "Feel better now?" I asked, smoothing her hair back from her face. She nodded solemnly, then looked at Sarah. "This is Ellie," she announced. "She's my best friend, but sometimes she falls down." "I can see that," Sarah said gently. "It's good that your daddy was here to help her." "Daddy always helps," Lily said with the absolute certainty of a child who has never doubted that her parent will be there when she needs them. "He fixes everything." I felt Sarah's eyes on me as I buckled Lily back into the cart seat and made sure she had a secure grip on Ellie. When I looked up, there was something in her expression that I'd never seen before. A kind of wonder, maybe, or recognition. "She's right," Sarah said quietly. "You do fix everything. You always did." I just couldn't see it then. We said goodbye after that, politely and carefully, like acquaintances parting after a chance encounter. Sarah watched us walk away, and I could feel her eyes on us until we turned the corner toward the dairy section. Lily immediately launched back into her campaign for princess cookies, and I found myself agreeing to a compromise. We could get regular cookies and she could put princess stickers on the package when we got home. The rest of our shopping trip passed in a blur. I was functioning on autopilot, checking items off Emma's carefully organized list while my mind processed what had just happened. I'd been preparing for this encounter for years without realizing it. And now that it was over, I felt strangely empty. Not sad, not angry, just complete somehow. Like a circle had finally been closed. Emma was in the garden when we got home, pulling weeds from the vegetable patch we'd planted in the spring. She looked up when she heard the car, and her face lit up in the way it always did when she saw us coming home. It was such a simple thing, that smile, but it represented everything Sarah had been wrong about. Emma's love wasn't complicated or conditional or dependent on me being someone other than who I was. It was just there, steady and reliable and real. "How was the store?" she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans as she came over to help with the groceries. "Interesting," I said, lifting Lily out of her car seat. "We ran into Sarah." Emma's eyebrows rose, but she didn't look upset or worried, just curious. That was another thing I loved about her. She trusted me completely, trusted us completely. The idea that seeing Sarah might threaten our relationship was so foreign to her that it didn't even occur to her to be concerned. No, how was that?" she asked as we walked toward the house, Lily running ahead of us to terrorize the cat. "Strange," I said honestly. "Good, I think." She apologized for what she said when we broke up. "That's good of her." Emma bumped my shoulder with hers. "How do you feel about it?" I thought about it as we unloaded groceries, as Emma started dinner while I played blocks with Lily, as we went through our usual evening routine of bath time and story time, and the complex negotiations required to get a 2-year-old to actually go to sleep. How did I feel about it? "Grateful," I said finally, after we'd gotten Lily settled and were sitting on our back porch with glasses of wine, watching the sun set over our neighborhood. "Grateful? For all of it." I took Emma's hand, interlacing our fingers the way we'd done thousands of times before. For Sarah breaking my heart, for learning how to be alone, for becoming the person you fell in love with. For this life we've built. Emma was quiet for a moment, studying my face in the golden light of early evening. "Do you think you would have been happy with her? If she hadn't cheated? If you'd gotten married like you planned?" It was a question I'd asked myself countless times over the years, especially in the early days when the pain was still fresh and I was still trying to understand what had gone wrong. But now, sitting here with Emma, the answer was crystal clear. "No," I said. "I don't think I would have been. Not really. I would have thought I was happy because I didn't know any better, but it wouldn't have been like this. We weren't right for each other, not in the way that matters for the long term. I just couldn't see it then." What changed? I changed. I thought about the man I'd been when I was with Sarah, eager to please, desperate to be loved, so focused on not losing her that I'd lost myself instead. I learned the difference between being loved for who I pretend to be and being loved for who I actually am. Emma smiled and leaned against my shoulder. "I like who you actually are." "Good thing, because you're stuck with him." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching our neighbors come home from work, listening to the sounds of other families settling in for the evening. It was such an ordinary moment, but that was exactly what made it extraordinary. This was the life Sarah had been so certain I'd never have. Not the dramatic, movie-worthy romance she'd been chasing, but something better. Something real and sustainable and deeply satisfying. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep, I found myself thinking about Sarah's words in the grocery store. She'd said she regretted what she'd told me, that it had been cruel and inexcusable. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I regretted it anymore. Not the words themselves, which had been devastating at the time, but the impact they'd had on my life. Those words had forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself. I had been settling for a relationship that wasn't quite right, playing a role instead of being authentic, prioritizing being loved over being known. Sarah's cruelty had shattered my complacency and forced me to rebuild myself from the ground up. And the person I'd become in that rebuilding process was someone I actually liked. someone worthy of the love I'd found with Emma. If Sarah had been kinder in her rejection, if she'd let me down easy and made it seem like our incompatibility was nobody's fault, I might never have been motivated to do that deep work on myself. I might have jumped into another relationship too quickly, bringing the same patterns and insecurities that had doomed things with Sarah. I might have spent years repeating the same mistakes, wondering why I could never quite find what I was looking for. Instead, her prediction that I would die alone had become a challenge that changed the entire trajectory of my life. I'd set out to prove her wrong, and in doing so, I discovered what I actually wanted and needed in a partner. I'd learned to value stability over excitement, authenticity over performance, depth over novelty. I'd learned that the right person doesn't make you feel like you're not enough. They make you feel like you're exactly enough, exactly as you are. The next morning, Emma asked if I wanted to talk more about seeing Sarah. We were having breakfast. Emma was getting ready for work while I got Lily dressed for daycare, and she'd clearly been thinking about our conversation the night before. "I'm curious about something," she said, spreading peanut butter on toast while simultaneously reviewing her patient notes for the day. "Do you think she was hoping to reconnect? Like romantically?" I paused in the middle of wrestling Lily into her shoes. It was a question that hadn't occurred to me, but now that Emma had raised it, I found myself replaying the encounter in the grocery store with fresh eyes. "I don't think so," I said finally. "I think she was just surprised by how things turned out. She seemed genuinely happy for me, but also maybe a little sad about the path she chose." "That makes sense." Emma finished her toast and came over to kiss me goodbye. People always think they want excitement over stability until they realize that excitement fades and stability is what actually makes you happy in the long run. After Emma left for work and I dropped Lily off at daycare, I found myself thinking about that observation. Emma was right. Our culture is obsessed with passion and intensity and the kind of love that looks good in movies. But real life isn't a movie. Real life is made up of Tuesday morning breakfast routines and grocery store runs, and the thousand small kindnesses that partners show each other over years and decades. Sarah had wanted someone who made her feel like she was living an adventure. But adventures, by definition, are temporary. They're exciting because they're unusual, because they take you out of your normal routine and make you feel like anything is possible. But you can't build a life on adventure. You can't raise children or buy a house or grow old together based on the adrenaline rush of new love. What Emma and I had was something much more valuable, a love that made ordinary life feel meaningful. She didn't make me feel like I was living in a movie. She made me feel like I was living in the best possible version of my actual life. The difference was subtle but crucial, and it was the reason we worked when Sarah and I never really had. I was still thinking about all of this when I got to work, and apparently my distraction was obvious because my colleague Mike asked if everything was okay during our morning meeting. "Just processing something," I said. "I ran into my ex yesterday, the one who really did a number on me before I met Emma." Mike winced sympathetically. He'd been through his own messy divorce a few years back and understood the particular kind of emotional archaeology that comes with encountering someone who'd been significant in your past. "How was that?" "Actually, pretty good. She apologized for some things she said when we broke up. Seemed genuinely happy for me when she saw that I have a family now." "That's mature of her." Mike paused, considering. "How do you feel about it?" It was the same question Emma had asked, and I was starting to realize that my answer was evolving as I processed the encounter. Initially, I'd felt grateful and vindicated, but now I was beginning to feel something else, a kind of compassion for Sarah that surprised me. "I feel sorry for her, actually," I said. Not in a condescending way, but genuinely sorry. She threw away something that could have been good for something that felt exciting, but turned out to be empty. And now she has to live with that choice. Do you think she knows that? I think she's starting to. I thought about the look in Sarah's eyes when she watched me with Lily, the wistfulness in her voice when she talked about my marriage. I think seeing me happy made her realize what she gave up. Not me specifically, but the possibility of building something real with someone. The conversation with Mike helped me crystallize something I'd been struggling to articulate. My encounter with Sarah hadn't been about vindication or revenge or proving her wrong. It had been about forgiveness. Not the kind of forgiveness that requires an apology or an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but the kind that happens when you realize that someone else's choices say more about them than they do about you. Sarah's prediction that I would die alone hadn't been based on any real assessment of my character or potential. It had been based on her own fears about settling, her own confusion about what she wanted, her own need to justify a decision she probably knew was wrong, even as she was making it. She'd lashed out at me because she was scared and guilty and trying to convince herself that she was making the right choice. Understanding that didn't excuse what she'd said or minimize the impact it had on me, but it did put it in perspective. Sarah's words had been about her, not me. They'd been a reflection of her own insecurities and confusion, not an accurate prediction of my future. That evening, I called my dad. It was something I'd been meaning to do anyway. We tried to talk every couple of weeks, and it had been longer than usual since our last conversation. But I also found myself wanting to share what had happened, to get his perspective on the whole situation. So let me get this straight, he said after I told him about the grocery store encounter. The woman who told you you'd die alone ran into you while you were shopping with your daughter, and she ended up apologizing for what she'd said? That's about the size of it. Dad was quiet for a moment. He'd never liked Sarah, though he'd been too polite to say so directly while we were together. But after the breakup, he'd made it clear that he thought I was better off without her. You know what I think, he said finally. I think seeing you with Lily probably gave her a glimpse of the life she could have had if she'd made different choices. Sometimes people don't realize what they're throwing away until they see someone else living it. Maybe. I was sitting in my home office, looking at a framed photo of Emma and Lily that I kept on my desk. I just feel like, I don't know, like I should be angrier about what she put me through. But mostly I just feel grateful that it happened. Why grateful? Because if she hadn't broken my heart, I never would have met Emma. I never would have had Lily. I never would have learned the difference between what I thought I wanted and what actually makes me happy. Dad chuckled. You know, your mother said something similar about her first serious boyfriend. Said he was completely wrong for her, but she was too young to see it at the time. Took him breaking up with her for her to realize she'd been trying to force something that was never going to work. It was a story I'd heard before, but it hit differently now. My parents had been married for 35 years, had built a life together that was defined by quiet contentment rather than dramatic passion. They genuinely enjoyed each other's company, supported each other through difficulties, and had created a stable, loving home for their children. It wasn't the stuff of romance novels, but it was real and lasting and deeply satisfying. Do you think Mom was hurt when that guy ended things? I asked. Oh, devastated at the time. But later she said it was the best thing that ever happened to her because it taught her what she was actually looking for in a partner. Sometimes you have to get your heart broken to learn what love really looks like. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about patterns, not just in my own life, but in the lives of people I knew who were genuinely happy in their relationships. Almost all of them had stories about previous relationships that hadn't worked out. Relationships they thought were perfect at the time, but could now see had been fundamentally flawed. Emma had her own version of this story. Before me, she dated a guy named Tom who was everything she thought she wanted. Ambitious, successful, charming, the kind of man who looked good on paper and made her friends jealous. But Tom had also been emotionally unavailable, critical of her career choice, and ultimately more interested in the idea of having a successful girlfriend than in actually building a life with Emma specifically. When Tom had ended things because he'd met someone he considered more suitable for his image, Emma had been crushed, but she'd also used that experience to clarify what she actually needed in a relationship. She'd learned to value emotional availability over surface-level success, kindness over charisma, genuine partnership over the appearance of having it all together. By the time we met, Emma knew herself well enough to recognize that what we had was different from what she'd had with Tom. Better, even if it was less flashy. More sustainable, even if it was less dramatic. Built on reality instead of projection. On who we actually were instead of who we thought we should be. It occurred to me that this might be the real lesson of my encounter with Sarah. Not that I'd been vindicated or that she'd been proven wrong, but that we'd both learned from our mistakes. I'd learned to value authenticity over performance, stability over excitement, depth over novelty. She'd learned that chasing thrills could leave you empty, that breaking something real for something fantasy was usually a mistake, that sometimes the person you think is settling is actually making the wiser choice. We'd both had to learn these lessons the hard way, through heartbreak and mistakes and the slow process of figuring out what we actually wanted versus what we thought we should want. But maybe that was the only way to learn them. Maybe some wisdom only comes through experience, through making the wrong choices and living with the consequences long enough to understand why they were wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my story with Sarah wasn't really a revenge story at all. It was a growth story, a story about two people who had to hurt each other in order to learn how to love other people better. It was a story about the difference between being right for someone and being wrong for them, and how sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them go find what they're actually looking for. That weekend, Emma and I took Lily to the zoo. It was one of those perfect autumn days where the air is crisp but the sun is warm, and Lily was beside herself with excitement about seeing the animals. She'd been talking about the big elephants all week, ever since Emma had mentioned the possibility of going. We were standing in front of the elephant enclosure, watching Lily's face light up as one of the massive creatures splashed in its pool, when Emma turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about what you said about seeing Sarah," she said, "about feeling grateful for all of it." "Yeah, I think I understand what you mean." Emma shifted Lily to her other hip so she could see better. "I'm grateful for Tom, too. Not because he was good for me, but because dating him taught me what I didn't want. It made me ready to recognize what we have." I slipped my arm around Emma's waist, pulling her closer. Lily was completely absorbed in watching the elephants, chattering about their big ears and long noses, with the kind of wonder that only children can maintain. "Do you think Lily will have to go through heartbreak to learn these things?" I asked. "Or do you think we can teach her without her having to experience it firsthand?" Emma laughed. "Are you seriously worried about our 2-year-old's future dating life?" "Maybe a little." I watched Lily point excitedly at a baby elephant that had just appeared from behind its mother. "I just want her to know her worth, you know. I want her to never settle for someone who makes her feel like she's not enough." "She won't," Emma said with quiet confidence. "She's growing up with parents who love each other and love her. She's going to know what healthy love looks like because she's seeing it every day. That's the best protection we can give her." Emma was right, I realized. Lily wouldn't need to learn about love through heartbreak because she was learning about it through example. She was growing up in a house where love was consistent and stable and unconditional, where conflicts were resolved with communication instead of manipulation, where both parents were valued and respected and supported in their individual goals and dreams. That was the ultimate revenge against Sarah's prediction, I thought. Not just that I'd found love, but that I'd found the kind of love that would be passed down to the next generation. Lily would grow up knowing that she deserved to be cherished exactly as she was, that the right person would enhance her life rather than require her to diminish herself, that love should feel like coming home rather than like constantly trying to prove yourself worthy. As we walked through the zoo that day, watching Lily's delight in everything from the playful otters to the majestic lions, I found myself thinking about legacy. Not the kind of legacy that gets written in history books, but the quiet legacy of daily choices, of small kindnesses, of the example we set for our children about how to treat other people and how to expect to be treated in return. Sarah's legacy in my life had been unintentionally positive. Her cruelty had motivated me to become a better person, to learn to love myself, to be ready for the kind of relationship I had with Emma. But the legacy I wanted to leave for Lily was different. I wanted her to learn about love through witnessing it, not through surviving its absence. I wanted her to know her worth because it had never been questioned, not because she'd had to fight to prove it. That night, after we'd gotten home and Lily had finally crashed from her zoo-induced excitement, Emma and I sat on the couch looking through the photos we'd taken. There was one of Lily reaching toward the giraffe enclosure, her face scrunched up in concentration as she tried to get the animal's attention. There was another of her giggling as a goat in the petting zoo licked her palm. There was one of all three of us together, taken by a kind stranger, where Emma and I were looking at Lily instead of the camera, our faces soft with the kind of love that can't be faked. Well, "We're really lucky," Emma said, scrolling through the images on her phone. "Yeah, we are." I thought about all the choices and chances and coincidences that had led us to this moment. Sometimes I think about the sliding doors version of our life. Like, what if I'd never worked up the courage to ask you out at that party? What if Sarah had never cheated and I just stayed in that relationship? "Do you regret not knowing?" Emma asked. Not knowing what that other life would have looked like? I considered the question seriously. There was a time when I would have been curious about the alternate timeline where Sarah and I had worked out, where I'd never experienced the devastating heartbreak that had ultimately led me to Emma. But now, sitting in the home we'd built together, looking at photos of our daughter experiencing joy with the pure intensity that only children can manage, I couldn't imagine wanting any other life. "No," I said finally. I don't regret not knowing. This is exactly the life I want. Emma smiled and curled up against my side. Even with all the sleepless nights and grocery store tantrums and stepping on tiny toys and bare feet, especially with all of that, I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. The messy parts are what make it real. That was the thing Sarah had never understood, I thought. She'd been looking for a life that felt like a highlight reel, all excitement and passion and Instagram-worthy moments. But real life isn't a highlight reel. Real life is made up mostly of ordinary moments. Tuesday morning breakfasts, and grocery shopping, and bedtime routines, and the thousand small ways that people who love each other take care of each other every day. The extraordinary moments are precious exactly because they're rare. Lily's first word, our wedding day, the moment the doctor placed our daughter in my arms for the first time, those moments are magical because they punctuate a life that's otherwise beautifully, satisfyingly ordinary. A few weeks later, I got a friend request on Facebook from Sarah. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out what it meant and how I felt about it. We hadn't spoken since that day in the grocery store, and I'd assumed that brief encounter was the extent of whatever reconnection we might have. I showed the request to Emma, not because I needed her permission, but because I'd learned that marriage works better when you're transparent about things that might matter to your partner. Interesting, she said, not looking particularly concerned. Are you going to accept it? I don't know. What do you think? Emma considered this, scrolling through Sarah's profile picture without clicking on it. I think it depends on what you want. Are you curious about her life? Do you want to stay in touch? I realized I wasn't curious, actually. I'd gotten the closure I needed from our conversation in the grocery store. I knew she was sorry for what she'd said. I knew she understood that she'd been wrong about my prospects. And I knew that she seemed to be living with the consequences of her own choices. That felt like enough. I think I'm good, I said. Knowing how that story ended is enough for me. I declined the friend request, not out of anger or spite, but because some chapters of your life are meant to stay closed. Sarah had played an important role in my story. She'd been the catalyst that forced me to become the person I needed to be, to build the life I actually wanted. But that didn't mean she needed to be part of the life I'd built. Besides, accepting the friend request would have felt unfair to Emma. Not because she would have been jealous or insecure, but because it would have introduced an unnecessary complication into our lives. Emma trusted me completely, but that trust was partly based on my good judgment about boundaries and priorities. Staying connected to an ex who had once tried to convince me I was fundamentally unlovable would have been poor judgment. Instead, I focused on what I had. I focused on Emma's laugh when Lily did something adorable and unexpected. I focused on the way Lily ran to me when I got home from work, like my arrival was the best part of her day. I focused on lazy Sunday mornings in bed with my wife and daughter, reading books and playing silly games and just enjoying each other's company. I focused on building a life that was everything Sarah had been convinced I'd never have. Not out of spite, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for second chances, for hard-won wisdom, for the kind of love that makes you want to be your best self, not because you're trying to earn it, but because it inspires you to grow. Sometimes the best revenge really is just living well. Not living well to prove a point or to make someone else feel bad about their choices, but living well because you've learned what actually matters, because you've figured out the difference between what looks good from the outside and what feels good from the inside. As I write this, Lily is napping, and Emma's at work, and I'm sitting in our kitchen. The same kitchen where I started this story. The same kitchen where I realized that Sarah's prediction about my future had been so completely, beautifully wrong that it was almost funny. In a few hours, Emma will come home and tell me about her day while I finish making dinner. Lily will wake up from her nap and demand to help with whatever we're doing, which will slow everything down and make everything more chaotic and somehow more perfect. We'll eat together and give Lily a bath and read her bedtime stories, and then Emma and I will have a couple of hours to ourselves to talk about our days and our plans and our dreams for the future. It's an ordinary life, the kind of life that doesn't make for dramatic movies or viral social media posts. But it's also an extraordinary life because it's built on real love and genuine partnership and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Sarah was wrong about my future, but I don't blame her for being wrong. She was trying to justify a decision she knew was hurtful, trying to convince herself that what we had wasn't worth preserving. She needed me to be inadequate so she could feel better about choosing someone else. But the truth is, I wasn't inadequate. I was just inadequate for her, and she was inadequate for me. We brought out each other's insecurities instead of each other's strengths. We made each other feel like we needed to be different people instead of like we were perfect exactly as we were. With Emma, I don't feel inadequate. I feel cherished and valued and supported and loved exactly as I am. And that's not because I changed everything about myself after Sarah left. It's because I found someone who was actually compatible with who I already was underneath all the insecurity and people-pleasing. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't proving someone wrong about you. It's proving yourself right about what you deserve. It's learning to recognize real love when you find it, and having the courage to build a life around it. Sarah thought I would die alone, but she was looking at the wrong definition of alone. Being alone isn't about being single. It's about being unknown, unseen, unloved for who you actually are. I was more alone in my relationship with Sarah, trying to be someone she could love, than I ever was in the months after she left when I was learning to love myself. Now I'm surrounded by people who know me completely and love me anyway. That's the opposite of dying alone. That's living fully, living authentically, living with the kind of deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. And if that's not the sweetest revenge of all, I don't know what is.